in Christianity, many splits had already occurred. There had been various heresies that had appeared already in the 2nd century and so on. And the letters of Paul even contain information from the 1st century about a lot of bitter conflicts and arguments. So religious argument, lack of unity, that's very typical in religion anyway. But at the same time, Christianity was not a legal religion under the pagan Roman Empire. That was because the Romans had a law that any religion was completely legal and could be practiced if it already existed when the Romans got there. That's why Judaism was legal. And even in spite of the various revolts of the Jews, it never happened that the Roman Empire ruled that Judaism per se was not legal. But Christianity was a newfangled cult that came out of Judaism after Roman rule had been established and therefore was illegal. So it was occasionally persecuted. And so the Christians tended to stick together for that reason and to try to not emphasize their differences for the sake of unity of facing this dominance. But once Constantine had become a Christian, that was reversed, and then everything came out in all of its luxurious fruition. The divisions then came out. The other thing was that the state had to define religion if it was going to be the ideological cement that held together the state. So the Christians in the pre-Constantine period could get along without establishing a firm, fixed Bible canon, for example, as different churches would use different apocryphal works in different cities and so on. And they need not have been too concerned about that. But once it was the official religion, everything had to be defined clearly. Constantine, a no-nonsense military man and politician, didn't care much about the niceties of the details of religion. He just wanted the bishops to decide something and then he would enforce it. And he wasn't going to sit around, having not been a Christian, and argue with them about points of theology. So he had to, he wanted a definition. But when you define it, then you also arouse opposition, and that happened. And since the people are always alienated from the state anyway in every time and place, the alienation of the people from the state tended to cause them to resist the state's definitions of religion and the state church, which created further division. So in Christianity, religious splits became politicized. And this is a major factor in the period of the history that we're looking at here. The first division was the Aryan heresy, when the Greek presbyter from Libya, which was nevertheless eastern Libya, the same part that is the base of the anti-Qaddafi forces in Libya today, where Benghazi is. That little area was the only part of the continent of Africa that had been successfully colonized and monopolized by the Greeks. So Barca or Cyrene in eastern Libya, that was called Pentapolis, the 5 cities, and in that very arid area, 5 Greek city-states existed, which continued the Greek culture there. And so a Greek presbyter from that place, Arius, claimed that logically, using Greek logic and so on, that if you mixed a mixture of one element of divinity and one element of humanity, the mixture that you got was less than completely divine. Therefore, Christ is of a lesser nature than God the Father. This was opposed, however, by the Alexandrians, who were already starting to develop what's called the Alexandrian Christology, that won out and dominated the theology of Christianity forever after and down to the present day. So that any evangelical Christians that you see can be said also to be spiritual descendants in some sense of the Alexandrian Christology. And so Alexander, the Patriarch of Alexandria, and his aide Athanasius, who is much more famous than Alexander, said, no, Christ is of the same nature as God the Father. So he's of a divine nature equal to the nature of God the Father. And the first ecumenical council at Alexandria, called by Constantine, ruled in favor of the Alexandrians in 325. That did not settle the issue because the succeeding Roman emperors backslid into Arianism until the death of Valens in 378. So there was a period in which a step was taken backward from the Alexandrian Christology, and Athanasius was occasionally persecuted and imprisoned and so forth, and leading him to become a great hero of the church. But the point is that you have that Christ is the same nature as God the Father. Now, it could be that there's some connection between the fact that ancient Egyptian paganism, the religion of Pharaonic Egypt, the Pharaonic religion had the concept and idea that Pharaoh was God, son of God, savior of mankind, savior of the human race, sitting in living incarnation. He was Horus, son of Osiris, sitting on the throne of Egypt. If he just curled his lip, the Nile would stop flowing. It was a domination unlike any other political domination in the history of the world. The Pharaonic domination was the most complete domination that any political system ever achieved over its people. And the fact that in Egypt, theophanies, which were divine manifestations, where gods would simply become incarnate as humans and walk around in human form and become gods, and all the gods would be spiritualized, and all the gods were just masks of one god, but they were also separate gods at the same time. No problem. That was something that was very easy for them to swallow and comprehend and accept, and they liked that idea. So when they came up against the concept that the Greeks under Arius would be saying that Christ is of a lesser nature than God the Father because of Greek logic, they didn't care for that. And they also started to see another feature, which was that they could use the Alexandrian Christology to overthrow the downtrodden status of their country, Egypt. Athanasius was an Egyptian in race or in nationality, not a Greek. He was called the Black Dwarf by his opponents. He wrote a biography of the monastic founder, St. Anthony, in Coptic. No Greeks ever learned Coptic. And so he was a Copt, he was an Egyptian. And the country of Egypt, having been bossed around and dominated by the Greeks under the Ptolemies for 300 years, and then the Romans for 300 years after that, and having been completely unable to resist, having been completely mistreated by the Roman Empire, because you had the idea that Egypt, being the most valuable province because of its agricultural bounty, its year-round growing season, its huge agricultural surplus, it was the private estate of the Roman emperor. And so the whole country belonged to the Roman emperor personally. Therefore, when Caracalla in 212 issued his citizenship decree giving citizenship to all of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire so he could tax them, he made several exceptions that women, condemned criminals, and slaves and Egyptians were not given the Roman citizenship. And so with that kind of abuse and exploitation, as Egypt is very concentrated, even today, Egypt for 5,000 years has been the most densely populated country on the earth. The population is very concentrated, so it's easy to tax, easy to control. They had things like the Egyptians had to wear a document showing that they had paid their tax around their necks. And there's like a card that showed they'd paid their tax to avoid the peasants fleeing from their farms, which they used to do as well to escape. So given all of that situation, the idea that the Alexandrian Christology represents in a hidden way an Egyptian independence movement is convincing.